Welcome, everybody, to Greek reading group today. So we're going to pick up in verse 18. So we're Luke 1:18. And just a little recap. Prior to this, Gabriel has been talking with Zacharias. He was allotted to go into the temple area and was offering the prayer of incense. And then the angel appears to him and starts talking about his son that would be coming, what to name him. And so basically John is going to come in the power and spirit of Elijah. We looked at last time how this picks up Malachi, the end of Malachi really, that before the great and terrible day of the Lord that God's going to send Elijah. Jesus says that, in fact, John is Elijah, fulfilling the role of Elijah. And so it's interesting how each of the Gospels deals with John the Baptist and Elijah in relation to Elijah. So John's prologue, chapter 1 of John, has a series of interrogators that come to John trying to clarify who he is. And one of the questions is, are you Elijah? And he says, no. And yet Jesus says, hey, I tell you, he is Elijah. So you have John downplaying in his self-understanding that I'm not Elijah. And yet Jesus saying he is fulfilling Elijah. So it's complex and interesting there to understand. So this is how Luke presents it then, that the angel is in fact foretelling Zechariah that his child is going to fulfill this role of Elijah as indicated in Malachi. And one reason I like the NASB is it places strong scriptural allusions and quotations into little caps. And this is just to help you. It's interpretive at times, but it's a way that would help people identify when there is a strong allusion. And I think there is very clearly an allusion here. Okay, so the angel communicates this to Zechariah, and then we're going to, in verse 18, hear Zechariah's response. Ki ipen Zacharias pros ton angelon, κατα τι γνώσαμε με τούτο. Εγώ γαρ εμί presbutes ke egunemu probebekia en tes imeres avtes. All right. So, and Zechariah said to the angel. Notice that the pros is used with the accusative rather than the dative case. And there's a distinction to be made between the two. Pros takes more space as opposed to just using the dative case. So I think this marks closeness, maybe proximity, possibly intensity. In Mediterranean cultures, you get close to somebody to talk. If you're getting intense, intimate, it could be intimate or it could be intensity. So here there's a little bit of prominence afforded to Zechariah's speech, I think. And the other thing to notice is that Zacharias has no article. He's already been introduced into the discourse. And when you introduce somebody into the discourse, you introduce without the article, and then you have reference back to that person with the article. That's the norm. Unless the person is saying or doing something significant. And so at this point, there is some stress on Zacharias' response because there's no article when we would expect an article. So that article, if it were present, would be typically classified as an anaphoric referent article. And we don't see that here. So that means that there's some extra marking here, emphasizing that Zechariah is doing something significant or saying something significant. And he asks the question, according to what will I know this? Now, this is This is an interesting way to form a question. Katati, katati. You might have expected maybe a post. How will I know this? Post gnosme tuto. So the katati is kind of a unique response. When I see that, I think that's a little bit different. Katati, according to what? Now, kata can have a distributed sense, distributive at times. It also can mark standard, like a standard. So here we're going to see that Zacharias is going to be chastised for his lack of faith in some regard. So if kata with the accusative is marking a standard, then it kind of makes sense why he's being chastised. He's going to be chastised by the angel, because there's been at least twice before in Hebrew scriptures where a barren woman or with a sterile man, whatever, that they've had children. So the standard has been set that when God wants to do something like this, he can do it. And so I think the kata t is marking something kind of interesting and really reflecting a lack of knowledge / faith on his part. We'll see. Particularly in comparison to Mary. When we get to Mary's response to the angel, there's actually a really interesting parallel between the two responses. And she also asks a similar type of question, but hers is more is not chastised. So why is his question chastised? Why is hers not? And I think it has to do with maybe the type of question and also the circumstances. She's a virgin, hasn't been with a man, whereas an older couple not bearing children, God twice previously, Abraham and Sarah, and then Hannah, the mother of Samuel, they each were able to bear children. So, but a virgin bearing a child, that hasn't happened before. So that's maybe more understandable for Mary to ask this kind of question. So the substantiation, the support for why Zacharias is thinking this way, which really goes back to this issue of having elderly parents bearing children. It's happened before. Is this: for I am ego gar imi. So the gar marks support. Ego imi is I am. Presbutes. Presbutes is an old man. So this is a predicate nominative. I am an old man, and hegunemu, my woman, my wife. I think here there is an implied estin. Probe be quia. Quia is a perfect active participle, feminine accusative, nominative, singular ending. This is it's a perfect tense. Remember that the perfect tense participles are reduplicated, and here's the reduplication. Probeno is to be, means to like be advanced. And there's an implied estin here. She is, my wife is advanced in her days. So in her days, in other words, she's getting up there. She's old. So, perhaps she's stopped her menstruation cycle, but she's old. So she's past the years of childbearing. So I'm old, and my wife is advanced in her days. So this is a paraphrastic construction with an implied form of imi, probably estin, and this would be stressing the advancedness of her in terms of her days. All right, so I think that's kind of what to see in that verse. Now the kes marking these are kind of continuing on in the scene. There's not really a new point being developed. It's just kind of things added into the scene or just continuing in the scene. Now here we see something interesting. I think this might be the first instance in Luke's gospel, and that is the use of apokrinome. Apokrinome actually presented a paper on this. I haven't published that research. I need to, because I looked at the use of the verb apokrinome in terms of pragmatic effect, following the work of Levinson and then Runge, as taking back control, and this verb is not simply just a circumstantial, like a adverbial participle. It really is marking something more than that. And when it's used, the person to whom it refers is taking control. And sometimes it's very dramatic. I suggest the translation of responding back, to respond back. And actually the backness is found with the apo. And so when I did this research looking into this term and how it was defined by ancient grammarians, this judging back in terms of taking control actually makes sense. So krino means to judge, and you can say to judge from, but then you can draw the implication to judge from in a way that you're rejecting and taking control and moving the conversation there's a pushback that's being communicated here. Now, sometimes these pushbacks can be in a more friendly setting with honor and shame in terms of, you want to do it this way, but we're going to do it this way. Other times there's a pretty strong pushback. So it just kind of depends on the context. We'll see later in Luke's gospel that this can be elevated to an indicative form. So the person answered back and said. And so when emailing with Stephen Levinson, I pointed that out, that there's you can elevate the effect of this by making it an indicative verb. And but here there is still a taking back of control, but it's put in the form of a participle, and I'd call it a circumstantial participle, probably functioning as a framework to understand what's happening. So responding back, the angel said to him, "I am Gabriel, the one standing before God. And I was sent to speak to you and to proclaim the gospel, to announce the good news of these things to you." Okay, so that's quite a response back. So it's interesting that Gabriel kind of responds in kind. So, Zacharias says, "I am old," and Gabriel answers back and says, "I am Gabriel." So, you have your way of accounting for yourself as if somehow that's going to prevent these things from happening. And Gabriel rather answers back with his identity, a named identity in relationship to God. I think that's pretty powerful. How often do we define ourselves by our age, by our circumstances, by whatever it might be? We let those things determine our reality. Whereas Gabriel says, "I have this reality. This is who I am. I stand before God, and I have been sent to speak to you. So I have a task that I'm fulfilling." And there's this, the apostolane is actually an aorist passive form, first singular. It's indicative. Typically we'd look for a theta eta ending with the aorist passives, but the theta is rejected by the lambda in the formation. And so this is an aorist passive, "I was sent." And the implication is that God sent him. And so this is what would be called a divine passive. So the God's activity is implied in the passive formation of the verb. So I was sent pros se, to you, lalese, to speak to you, and then to announce. These are each infinitives. They're aorist infinitives. This one's aorist middle formed from evangelids ome, to speak to you these things. Yeah, so these are infinitives, I would say, of purpose. They almost feel like complementary infinitives, but you're working with a verb of motion. And so when you have an infinitive with a verb of motion, there's an implied purpose in order to speak to you and to announce the good news of these things to you. Yeah, so this is appositional. So I am Gabriel. If I were marking this, I'd put an equal sign, the one standing before God. So that's a very amazing role that Gabriel has, the one who stands before God. Yeah, and this is a perfect active participle, nominative masculine singular, substantive use in apposition to Gabriel. Yeah, so the one standing in front of God. All right, so I don't know if there's anything else to mention there. So these things is referring to what he's just explained to Zacharias, and to announce the good news of these things to you. Ke idu esse siopon ke me dunamenos lalese akriis imeras yenete tavta anth on uk epistevsas tis legus mu itines plerothe sonte is ton keron avton. All right. And behold, the idu is an attention getter, and it sets off what follows as particularly noteworthy. And so this is going to be the consequence of what happens to Zacharias. So esse is the future active indicative or future indicative second singular from imi, working with a participle, siopon. This is a future periphrastic construction. You will be silent and not able. So this is also periphrastic, not able to speak. So here we have the consequences being meted out. So another periphrastic construction. And this verb dunamenos, duname, takes an infinitive often to complete its meaning. So this would be a complementary infinitive. May is typically used with non-indicative moods. There are some exceptions to that, but that's typically true. U sometimes can be used with non-indicative moods, would be one that sometimes can occur. Yeah, you will be unable to speak akri. So akri is an improper preposition, which simply means that it sometimes can function as a conjunction. These improper prepositions will always take the genitive when they're used as prepositions. And in this case, it jumps right into a prepositional, the relative pronoun clause. So there's a little bit of a compaction of the construction here. Typically, you would have akri imeras, until the day which these things occur. So that would be typically the order, until the day ace. But this construction does occur. It occurs in Romans 2:16, until which day. So it may be a little bit of or on the day which. So if we go to look at Romans 2:16, there's a, I guess there's a textual variant there where you can see the a emera there, in which day. So something similar occurs there, at least in the textual variant with Vaticanus. So this kind of thing happens where the preposition goes right into the relative pronoun clause. Now, how I would translate that would be, until which day these things occur. So until which day these things occur. That'd be simply how I would translate it. Now, maybe, I think translations are going to take that as until the day these things occur, which is shorthand for until the day. We'll see they have to add a when to make a subordinate clause. So that's kind of explaining the grammar, until which day these things occur on own. And this is another prepositional phrase with the preposition anti. Anti takes the genitive. It can be used in a sense of substantiation. On account of which things you didn't believe my words. On account of which things you did not believe my words. And so there's some sense that this clause that is formed with this preposition with the relative pronoun is supporting the what has just happened. So it is kind of interesting to think about it, and it's almost like in exchange for your not believing my words, you're going to be silent and not able to speak. So there's a consequence here that's being explained out. So the anti means in return for, and for return for which things you did not believe my words. So it's a little bit of an idiom here, but it does convey the idea that there is a tit for tat happening here. Not believing my words on account of which these things, then you're not going to be able to speak. You're going to be silent and not be able to speak. All right. And then you have the itenes plerothesonte is ton keron avton. These things being fulfilled will be fulfilled in their time. So because of these words, which will be fulfilled in their time, in their proper time. Keron is a word. Keros means like a season, like a particular season, or it can be translated opportunity, but it's more than just chronos time. It's a pregnant time, pun intended here, since that's what's happening. But so it's a kind of time that is special time. So in their special season, special time. So the itenes is a relative pronoun type. It's an indefinite relative pronoun referring back to lagis. And then we're talking about fulfillment here. They will be filled in their time. So this is then the end of Gabriel's speech. So he pushes back, responds back to Zacharias with his own identity statement, which is different than Zacharias's, which is out of a position of lacking and very circumstantial. And Gabriel has he understands his identity differently in relation to God, which really Zacharias should have had. He shouldn't have been asking according to what standard will I know this, or why will I know this? But I think the kata ramps it up. He should know this, that God is capable of this. And in fact, he himself kind of acknowledges we're old, but that didn't stop Abraham and Sarah, a story that he would have known well, from God blessing them with a child. So this is really no reason at all. I think it's interesting how in our logic with thinking through situations, sometimes we're providing what we think are strong arguments, but they're really not strong arguments. It kind of reminds me of the steward, the parable of the talents, and to the one given 5, he makes 5 more. To the one who's given 2 or 3, he makes more. But to the one who was given 1, he said, I know that you're a hard master, and so I went and hid it. And that doesn't really make sense, because he could have invested even that 1, knowing that the master was hard. So really his reasoning was true, but it didn't justify the actions. And so it just says to me that oftentimes in our sinful perspective, we provide reasons that really are unreasonable, and we're kind of blind to the lack of logic that we're providing. And we must think that it's kind of a rationalizing. We must think it makes sense, but it really doesn't make sense. Okay, so outside, what's happening? Well, here the scene is continuing. One thing is added to another. The emergent scene keeps being added, and ein o laos prostokon ton Zacharian ke ethav madzon ento kronidzin en to nao avton. And the crowd, or the people, were awaiting prostokon. So here we're having another periphrastic participle. So a periphrastic participle, remember, is usually a participle in the nominative case that's working with a form of the verb imi, although it could be other forms, other verbs like yenome, genomai, erasmian, yenome, or even arko. Those are much rarer. So yeah, another periphrastic participle. So the people were awaiting ton Zacharias. Now this is what we should expect. Zacharias with an article. He's a known entity, and this is what we should have expected. So they are awaiting Zacharias, and evthalmadzon, they were marveling. This is from thalmadzo, which means to marvel at. And it's imperfect active indicative third plural. And what this suggests, this use of the imperfect, is that they were marveling over a period of time. So they're standing around, and why they're marveling, what they're marveling at particularly, was his delaying, or his spending of time in the temple. So the ento with the infinitive, kronidzin, with the accusative subject, this is a particular infinitive construction. It's the preposition with the article, with the infinitive and accusative case subject construction. That's a long name for that construction. But you have prepositions like pros form this, is forms this, pro forms this, dia, and then meta. And so and each one of those marks a different semantics. N is marking time, at which, ento, at the delaying, the time spent, his time spent in the temple. So this is indicating what they were marveling at. And so basically the scene that the imperfect indicative verb here, marveling, they're standing around going, looking at their watch or looking at the time dial, whatever was available to them. They're looking at and wondering about the time passage there, and they're just going, wow, what is going on? There is a lot of time passing at this. And so they were marveling at that. Okay. And now here we have a new step here, like a new the next stage of the development of the story. So the kes have been just combining things, but the de marks this off as a new development. And really, the new development we're going to see is that edunato lalese avtis. He's unable to speak to him. So, exelthon de uk edunato lalese avtos ke epegnosan oti optasian e oraken ento nao ke avtos ein dia nevon avtis ke diemenen kofos. All right. Ex elthon. This is a circumstantial participle. It's masculine nominative singular aorist from ex erkome. It is circumstantial. It agrees with the subject. It's nominative, and probably providing a segue. This is just segueing from him being inside to being outside. I don't think it provides an important framework. We could maybe understand this as like a procedural thing, but I think it just simply moves the story along. De, as we said, marks new development, and then we have the imperfect tense of duname. He was continually or repeatedly unable to speak to them. So he came out and, he's trying to speak. Maybe he's gesturing. Maybe he's, looking at things. I don't know. But he is unable to talk. Yeah. So, yeah, he's unable to talk. And over a period of time. And they did not know. Oh, and they knew, and I should say rather, and they knew. This is from epignosko, aorist active, third singular. They knew that. The OT is marking the content of what they knew, a content clause. OT here indicates the content of the knowing. They knew that, and this is forwarded, a vision, optasian. You can see the stem opta, opt, which has to do with singing. Optometry has to do with the eyes that he had seen. And this is perfect tense. This verb horao commonly takes the perfect tense, but he had seen a vision in the temple. So somehow, because he couldn't speak, so he's unable to speak, but he must have been gesturing with his hands, and they knew, somehow they were able to discern and know that he'd seen a vision. And the Ke here explains a little bit more about what he was doing. He was gesturing, and he himself, avtos. Now, avtos is not strictly needed, although we're kind of switching back and forth between him and then them and then back to him. And then we have another periphrastic participle construction. He was dia nevon, and this verb has to do with signing, to gesture. So he was gesturing to them and was remaining mute. He was mute, unable to speak. So here we we have really a filling out of what was happening. He was gesturing and he couldn't speak, and he's trying to, maybe he was acting like an angel. What's the sign for angel? There was angel speaking, something. He's somehow gesturing. And so they're like, wow, he's seen a vision. And then we have the story continuing in verse 23. And it happened, ke ieneto os epleisthesan e emere tes liturgias avtu apelthen iston ikon avtu. So, and it happened as the days of his service were fulfilled, that he went home to he departed to his house. Okay, so this is the ke yeneto is a transition. It's a narrative transitioning symbol. So there's a little bit of a tension here. The ke is marking continuity, but then the yeneto is marking a transition as well. So the os is can signal as or since, can be translated as or since. And then we get the content, the situation under which then the main content is occurring, that he departed into his house. So ieneto is setting up kind of like a content. The basic content of that is that he departed to his house. And then the circumstance, the cause of that is that the days of his service ended. So he was part of a regiment, and they were chosen to be serving in a temple at that time, and the lot fell to him to go into it, but then he still had some responsibilities there. But when that ended, then he departed to his home. Yeah, so that's a pretty simple sentence. And then you have the meta de tauta tes imera. So we have a des signaling the next development. And the next development is that Elizabeth conceives. So meta de tauta tes tas imeras sun elaben Elizabeth e gune avtu ke periekrupen eotein menas pente legusa. And then it goes on to the OT clause. So next step, the de marks the next step. After these days, Elizabeth, his wife, got pregnant, conceived. And peri ekruben eoton menas pente, for 5 months, concealed it, or she kind of stored up these things. Yeah, so this verb peri krubo. Yeah, so she knew it was happening, but she was concealing it. And then for 5 months, concealing herself, 5 months, saying. And then the legusa is a feminine participle, present active, nominative singular. This is post-nuclear. So here's the main verb. And this would be explanatory, like what is going on in regard to her keeping this to herself, saying, and then we have the content of what she was saying in verse 25. Oti utos mi pepi eken kurios en emeres es epiden aphelin o nidos mu en anthropis, saying, thus the Lord to me has done in the days which my shame he looked at to remove. He looked to remove my shame among people. Okay, so the OT is indicating the content of her speaking. And so inside of her, her reasoning, this is what we learn. The Lord has done this to me. The Lord has done this for me thus. So the thus is the fact that she's conceived. That's going back to the fact that she's conceived. The Lord has done this. This is a perfect active indicative from poieo, a third singular. To me, for me, is indicating the recipient of the action. During the days which he removed or he looked upon. So this is from epi, is it orao? Yeah, ep orao, to see upon, to see upon. And then we have an infinitive, probably of purpose, to remove my shame. He looked upon to remove my shame. Yeah. Yeah. And this is a neuter accusative. So in form, it's a third declension noun that then the nominative and accusative form looks the same. And this is the object of being removed. And then in the context of the shame is among people. So my shame among people. So we have to remember that being barren was seen as not a good thing at all. And people were murmuring and thought, what did they do? What did she do? She's been cursed by God. And so she's had this happen to her, that she's been barren all this time. So she's recognizing that what's happened to her is, in fact, the Lord's doing to remove this shame that she's had. Now, there are some textual variants here. This one is simply the presence of the article. So the article would simply mark that the Lord is a known entity, a known actor. And so the presence or absence of this article is really a matter of whether the Lord is emphasized or not. The lack of article emphasizes the Lord's action. The presence of the article would simply recognize him as a staged, active participant. That's the difference. And there's a lot of textual variants with articles. Now, they're not always marked in their text because there's, almost 1 out of 5 words is an article. And if you started marking every single textual variant with articles, this is merely a scribe's wrestling with the activation status of entities in the discourse. Here, there's probably another variant has to do with the shame. There's an article there. That's the textual variant, is whether there's an article, to onidos, whether that has an article or not. And this is the first time that onidos has been mentioned. And so you'd expect that it would be without the article because it's being introduced into the discourse. We haven't been learning about Elizabeth's shame, although it's been implied. So that's the difference, whether it's a known or unknown entity. So the scribes, as they're writing this, as they're copying, they would be inadvertently not even maybe aware of these things, because in their mental representation, they're copying it as they're perceiving of the activation status of these nouns or these participants. But anyway, more research needs to be done on that. I've been trying to get someone to dissertate with me looking at that kind of thing, information structure in terms of that. Yeah, so I think that's it for verse 25. This is kind of a privatized speech that she gives. And I think we can maybe finish another verse or so here. 26. Ende to menito ecto apostale o angelos Gabriel apo tu theou is polentes Galileas e onoma Nazareth pros parthenon emene stev menen andri o onima Iosef ex iku David ke to onima tes parthenu Mariam. All right. So that indicates the next step in the story. And in the 8th month, so ekto is an adjective in second attributive position to meni. So these are all in agreement. It just simply means the 8th month. And then we have the angel Gabriel mentioned. Now, Gabriel is a known entity. So it's the article, was sent. And then here we actually have the specified from God. So the apo to theou is understood. And interestingly, the textual variant is changing the apo to upo, which would suggest more direct agency. In my chapter where I deal with agency and source and these kinds of things, I do talk about apo sometimes being used to indicate agency, but conveyed by way of source. This is an aorist passive indicative third singular. Once again, it's got the augment right there, ape, stal, the. The theta is again dropped because of the influence of the liquid stem with the lambda. So in the 8th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God into the city of Galilee by name, to the name of which its name was Nazareth. Okay, so this is probably like a dative of possession, whose name was Nazareth. And so it starts up a relative pronoun, but then the dative case has to be explained, but it's not uncommon for place names to be used with the dative. But then we can also explain the dative as a dative of possession in reference to onoma, the name of which was Nazareth. And then we're going to continue to get more qualifiers. So this is all qualifying sent. So sent from God into the city, which had a certain name, to a virgin. And then this verb is perfect middle passive participle, which has to do with like betrothal, having been betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph. So here we have that construction again with the dative, whose name was Joseph, from the house of David. And then we have this little add-on, and the name of this virgin was Mary. So an implied form of the verb imi was Mary. Yep. So we're stage setting. There's a new development here, and we're getting introduced to Galilee, the place of Galilee, particularly Nazareth. We're getting introduced to Joseph. He's from the house of David. So this is recalling kind of prophetic expectation. And then we're also getting the name of his wife, Mary. And I think we can maybe finish 28, 29, 30. I don't know if we're going too fast. But Luke is pretty long, so we got to keep going. Ke is elthon pros aftain ipen. Kire ke karato mene o kurios metasu. E de epito logo dietar acte ke dialogidzeto patapos ie o aspasmos utos ke epen o angelos avte. And we'll probably not get to that, but we can we'll start pick up there next time. But and coming to her, and the one coming to her is Gabriel. So Gabriel was the one who was sent, and then coming to her, he said. So entering to her he said. So this is a circumstantial participle agreeing with the subject of the verb. So entering to her, he said, rejoice. All right, so this is probably providing a segue to the next part of the scene, is that he actually comes into her presence and he says, rejoice. Okay, this is an imperative form, second singular, present, be rejoicing, having been graced one. So this is nominative, or actually vocative. I think as a direct address, it's a perfect middle passive participle from katā, and he's calling her out as one who has been shown favor. The Lord is with you. And this is a elliptical statement with the implied form of the verb to be, the Lord with you. The Lord is with you. Yeah, so this is, notice that it's set off by commas. It is functioning as a direct address. She is being identified as in the state of being graced because the Lord is with you. And she was troubled. Next step. And she, and this is an idiom with of going back and forth between one speaker and the next. So you can use just the article to signal the switching of subjects. This is a good classical idiom. And usually we see it with like masculine articles, but since it's referring to her as female, we see the feminine article. And so this is almost simply just translated as a she, but it's part of it. It is just the article marking her as switching the subject. But she, at this word, was troubled, and not just tarasso, but diatarasso. So diatarasso, tarasso is probably stressing this even more, trouble through and through, and was reasoning in herself. And so this is imperfect dialogizo me. It's a middle formed verb. So this is describing kind of like an inner processing that she's undergoing. And then the content of this processing is potapos. What sort of greeting is this? So this is an optative, and we don't see very many optatives, but this is an optative being used in a subordinate clause in historical narrative. When you're in a historical narrative sequence and you pop to a subordinate clause, it is good classical idiom to use the optative to indicate that. So in that situation, it's called an optative and secondary sequence. So you have a past events, and then you have a subordinate clause. You could pop into the optative mood for that. What sort of greeting is this? And the patapos is marking quality. This interrogative adjective marks kind. What sort of, or kind. This is why in my marking, the color coding, it's pink, but it is stressing quality. So not simply what greeting is this, but what kind, what sort of type of greeting is this? So this is an indirect question. So the direct question would be, what sort of greeting is this? But it's put into secondary sequence with the main verb. She was wondering what sort of greeting this was. And that's how it's translated. She kept pondering what kind of greeting this was. And because it's put as an indirect question, that's why you can use the optative here. Yep. So, well, we've covered a lot of ground. I guess about 11 verses or so, 11 or 12. And we'll look at the angel's speech next time. So, all right. Well, thank you. Have a good week. and we will see you next week. Take care.